Well, hello everyone.
Hi everyone.
That was some hard rock, if you'll pardon the pun, and some very deep bass as well, which is deeply important, isn't it? Yeah. No, seriously though. Yeah. When fantasy calls, and you can take the rest of the lyrics and see where that goes, according to your inclination. But with respect to this, is a very serious subject. Fantasy is a hugely important thing. It's something that humans probably uniquely can do, certainly to the extent that we do. And just what fantasy is in and of itself is important to understand with respect to consciousness. So fantasy then is usually an involuntary representation of information that moves us away from our immediate experience and then represents something else. And that representation usually bottoms out in instinct. Hard as rock, deep bass. And Pauline just went into trance. I wonder why.
Yeah, well, this is the problem, isn't it, with fantasy?
Yes.
And once you make the suggestion of fantasy, even by suggesting things like hard rock, it takes you away from the immediate moment and the reality of what you ought to be doing.
Yeah, that's how I got her when she was 16, which is a long time ago because she's 61.
And you're still getting me off balance. Even now.
Yes, and I'm still getting hard as rock as well, so don't worry about that. I play it every day. Hard rock, that is, hard rock records.
Yes, so the purpose of fantasy.
Yeah.
The importance of it, the significance of it. And,
yes.
How it, to some extent, sets itself up, or how we can be sidelined into it almost by the things that we do sometimes. We may not realize that we are actually contributing to a fantasy state being set up. And one example of that would be when either people say impose something like fasting.
Oh, yeah.
So they go without food either voluntarily or involuntarily for a long period of time, and then they put themselves psychophysiologically in a hypoglycemic state.
Yeah.
And it's well known amongst people who practice meditation, for example, that they will do that prior to meditation to put themselves in a trance-like state, a dissociable state, in order to then allow fantasy to come through.
Yeah, that's interesting, because hypoglycemia is obviously not something that you should mess with, because it can be fatal.
It can indeed. Yes, the end point of that is coma for some people,
and death
and death taken to an extreme. Yes, of course.
But as you say, I mean, we both know of people who have found ways of utilizing hypoglycemia to maintain themselves in a state of fantasy relatedness to the moment. But the key, as we said at the beginning, is obviously that fantasy is not really located in the present time. It's an anticipation of the future, very often not a real one, within which people can duck their fantasies and their libido. And that brings all sorts of problems, because once we exercise that and we build up this containing vessel of fantasy, then that becomes a habit. In effect, a complex, which is dissociated, set apart from normal conscious will and intentionality. And it can sit there, it can cap instinct and effectively bleed off our energy. It's got an adaptive value, because in the short term, at least, it can allow us to deal with issues that we wouldn't normally be able to deal with. So the fantasy replaces reality in that sense.
Yeah, so the repression is the problem, Steve, really, isn't it? The disconnection from the past, which of course still exists. It might no longer be in conscious awareness, but it will still be represented in an informational state in some other form. And the fantasy really is just a distraction away from that, a kind of a transitional state between states, between the past and some future adaptation that no doubt would be better for that person, but they're still in that in-between state when they're deep into fantasy in that way.
Yeah, so with this individual then that we're considering at the moment, then there was an amnesia for a period of time, which as I recall, he said it was the last 2 years.
Yes, I think it was, yeah.
But it's probably more than that, because that's plugged into all the time that led up to that in his life. And all of those influences are in effect being repressed. And we're seeing what Pierre Janet called an abasement of consciousness. Carl Jung agreed with him on that.
Yes, he would have done, yeah.
Augmented by the fasting and the hypoglycemia.
Yeah.
And you're literally seeing a personality attempt to reboot itself, and part of that is imprinting onto the local landscape that he's aware of in a mythological way.
Absolutely. And you know, the most obvious myth for that is the myth of Arthur, actually.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that you and the land are one, and that you the connection to the land is very important. And this is somebody who's trying to adapt to a new place, a new geographical location, and is almost in a process of mythologizing the land as a result of that. Yeah. And we know from, if we were just to take the Arthurian myth, and we take the state that Arthur was in the myth, and his physical health was ailing as well. Yeah. And there are parallels with this person, with the case study, in so much as they're in a fragile physical state.
Can I just ask for clarity there? So that's to do where the land is wasting.
Yes.
And the king is wasting. And this is just before he receives the grail.
That's right.
Realizes that he and the land were one.
Yes.
And drinks from the grail. Yeah. And then as he then becomes a complete person and reconnects, the land then responds to that and opens out. Yeah. Yeah, I get that. And that's actually what you see with this person. And we've seen it with others as well. Yeah. Yeah, that's really important. Yeah. And the mythological elements, or the beginning to attempt to mythologize the situation by this person, is actually quite fragile, and that's something that needs to be helped.
Yes, it does. It's, you know, when someone is in that state, as you rightly put it, Steve, they're in a very vulnerable state. They're walking something of a tightrope, really. And you know, the solution's in the myth if you look for it. Yeah. And it may be because this person is so vulnerable and so dissociated that it would require something of that strength, of a mythological strength, to actually help him and to solve the problem, the situation.
And he's an informed person, isn't he?
Yeah, very much
and
so.
The particular location where he's moved to has roots in the Arthurian tradition, and he does know that. Right? He's not, to my knowledge, articulating an Arthurian angle on what he's going through. But he is attempting to reboot himself, I think, and imprint onto the environment. But what we're seeing, as you've rightly said, is that transitional stage within which it is dangerous potentially.
Yes.
So the fantasy is an attempt, in this case, at self-healing, but the relationship to the fantasy is something that needs to be very carefully managed, because this person's past is such that he has dissociated throughout his life. When things have overwhelmed him, he's done that, and he's lost all connection to reality.
Yes.
And then things have moved around in the environment and taken control of his life. And then he just sinks deeper and deeper into the fantasy. So if he were to repeat that, that would be a problem.
Yes, that's the repetition compulsion element, as Freud would have described it.
Yes, indeed.
And in that sense, it's seeking a solution. You know, that's why these things are repeated in the way that they are. And you're right, it does have to be very carefully managed, particularly because when somebody is in that state and they're becoming less and less adapted to the outer world, they stop noticing things that actually matter in the environment. And, you know, they may start to neglect relationships, for example, or they may even, just little things like, you know, when someone's in a dissociated state, because often they get clumsy or forgetful, or you just know that they're not plugged in to what's happening right now. And so there's the potential for physical harm as well, actually, to come to that person. I mean, Jung would have certainly had something to say about that, that people put themselves sometimes in situations where they they feel they can no longer cope or adapt to the demands of outer life, and something happens to them to stop them, to kind of forestall, I guess, things becoming worse. And it, you know, I'm not suggesting that at all that this would happen with this person, but when you're in that state, when you're in that trance-like, almost zombie-like state, you're more likely to be less aware of the physical surroundings and everything that's happening in them.
Yeah, there's a number of things that are really important, I think, for people to understand how they can actually articulate themselves to reality when they're in that state themselves. You're absolutely right. Jung did say that. Basically, the unconscious will be met with in the form of fate on the outside if it's not integrated, which is not a very pleasant thing to hear.
No.
It doesn't have to be like that.
No, it doesn't at all.
Because there are other ways of addressing that, and that would include understanding how to deal with the trickster, because it's inevitable that the trickster will manifest in this person's life. In fact, we know that it has in the past. So the trickster's already attempted to compensate for the one-sidedness present. And whilst the person bolsters themselves in fantasy, then they won't necessarily see that the configuration is already arranging itself within and without with respect to the trickster. It's like riding a tiger. The tiger of the trickster function, because it will attempt to compensate for all of that. So there's that element too, but there's a third position you can take, which is if there's enough reality orientation left. That's to do with superpositioning of information that exists in several states simultaneously. And when we know that, then we can avoid collapsing into an ego that's essentially collapsed around its own dissociation and shut out everything else, and is accessible only to the fantasy dissociation that it's set up to help it get through. So there's a lot of things that can be done there.
There is, and most people still have enough of an intact ego to be able to work with it and to make sure that the adaptation to outer life is sustained whilst the fantasy is understood as being maybe an anticipation of some kind of future adaptation. So where the ego is still intact in that way, it should be worked with, and that person should be helped to orientate themselves. I mean, again, just to give an extreme example with something, say, like psychosis, maybe even what Jung would have called a latent psychosis, where you would again get a superpositioning of information in so much as the information that is there and leading up to that person having a psychosis, in the sense it becomes manifest, is pre-existing. It's there prodromally, maybe for many, many years before it erupts into a psychosis, and in that very florid way that we tend to think of psychosis. For some people, that's imposed on them. They, you know, it's not as if they put themselves under the conditions of a fast, or they're subject to, say, they take drugs and that induces a psychosis. It's something that just erupts from within. And of course, when that happens, that's a very, very unfortunate set of circumstances. And it's far harder to address that than it is, say, with somebody whose ego is still pretty much intact and can still have a relationship to the outside world. So I just thought I'd add that in, because there are some extreme situations where, you know, that person's done nothing really to contribute actively, that is, to the manifestation of fantasy in that kind of raw form that it comes through in psychosis.
They're all very different states, aren't they?
They're all very different states, which is why it's important to make those distinctions, really.
This person has managed dissociation, or learned to live with it, from my understanding of his life, for all of his life, and in that sense it's easy for him to go back into that state. The danger is, though, that every time this happens, the trickster will be constellated, and will attempt to force him to adapt properly rather than through fantasy. And that's the point at which he can either grow or he can collapse back on himself, and then the fantasy won't achieve anything other than to maintain himself being in that maladaptive position. And because the relationships around him, although they're new or relatively new, will be obliged to relate to him the way everybody else has in the past, which means then the future being predicted most strongly by the past, it's likely to bring about a situation where future relationships or present ones are experienced in the same way, because this person's defaulting back to the same way of adapting through fantasy. And this is a highly specialized way of looking at something, and it's a clinical one, but it's a natural observation, isn't it, of the way these things work through. So it's one kind of fantasy and one kind of issue, isn't it? But as you say, the prodromal representation of fantasy is you can see it. Some people say they can see it retrospectively.
Yeah.
But with enough experience, you can see it before it happens fully. And these collapsed, immutable ideas and the insistence on adapting to the world through them, that rigidity, is a dangerous thing in and of itself.
Yeah. Yes, it is. People, as I think you're suggesting, Steve, become very grooved.
Yeah.
And those ideas often just start off, for some people anyway, as being what we would call fixed ideas. And of course, not everyone who has fixed ideas goes on to have, a psychotic episode.
No.
It doesn't have to follow on that that's the case. But where there is inflexibility in the personality and in the way that someone is thinking about things or perceiving things, it makes it more difficult for them to break out of that state.
Yeah.
And not that it can't be done, but it does. And the way to do that really is because a lot of fantasy pushes people towards the culture and towards the mythologizing of things, as opposed to taking them back to where fantasy is originated, which is, back towards instincts and into the genome. And then that's ultimately where the solution lies, because that's where people find real meaning in their lives.
They do, and this is a hard thing to get across without being technical.
It is, yeah.
But there are fundamentally 3 phase states of consciousness.
That's right, yeah.
There's the normal cognition that our everyday consciousness utilizes. And then there's emotional, affective consciousness, which is much older, and that insists itself upon us. It's phylogenetic and evolutionary older, but it's an independent phase state of consciousness. And the third one that's the most important and can link both is meaning. I'll come to that in a minute, but obviously cognition and affect are in different languages. They're a polarity. And when you get someone who may have a very high level of academic training, and is rather proud of the way that they can think, then when affect consciousness impacts them, they don't understand it because it's in a completely different language. But what they are aware of is that they've been seized or possessed by a numinous quality, a qualia of consciousness, which is visceral, it's hormonal, and it's overwhelming, and it reinforces the cognition, and that's the mistake. It's there to complement and compensate for the one-sided nature of consciousness. But unfortunately, people who identify too much of cognition, when they receive the compensation in the form of emotion, don't treat it as that. They treat it as an inflationary medium through which to reinforce their one-sidedness, rather than see that there's a difference here that's being offered as a suggestion. And that suggestion is not to identify with the emotion, but to go where, as you've said, the emotion came from. What authored that emotion? And where it's authored is deeper within what we could call the psyche or the unconscious, if we're thinking in a Jungian sense. And that's where meaning itself comes from. And meaning is transcendent to both cognition and affect. Where academics go wrong is very often that when they are in that divided state and they begin to identify with the affect, which is attempting to compensate for them, in order to translate the emotion, they generate fantasy.
And in classical Jungian terms, you could say they were possessed by the negative anima.
Yeah, because it's Maya, illusion.
Yeah.
And in that sense, what you see is a collapse of cognition around the core misunderstanding that they have, and then the paradoxical inflation that's affect charged of that. And any perception or apperception of a potential meaning is mythologized and turned into something which is completely separate to reality, the reality that's trying to come out from them and the reality that exists externally. The fantasy itself then it has to be compensated for. So what you get is instinctive pressure to try to push that out of the way and correct for the imbalance in consciousness. That generates the impression of pressure from within. And then the way that the ego deals with that is to just inflate itself even more with more ideas. So meaning becomes a reified abstraction rather than an experience.
Yes.
And the affect, which is also trying to signal something to cognition, that ramps up as well, and they just spiral off into being what Jung called a mana personality. And the fantasies then will take on internet guru proportions, and the inflation becomes religiose. In other words, it has a religious quality about it. So whatever capacity that person has then is in service of the fantasy, and they're being moved away, aren't they, from reality. So that's another way that fantasies can be problematical when they're not understood.
Yeah. Well, when people do, and we see this over and over again, the people that we work with and just people that we know in our lives generally, that typically when someone has a numinous experience, and by that I mean they are experiencing the numinous, if I can maybe emphasize it in that way, that they actually lose the capacity to speak about what it is they're experiencing. So cognition is attenuated, or they find it incredibly difficult to talk about what it is that's going on. That has to come after. The amplification comes later on. And if you try and disturb someone when they're going through something numinous, you actually rob them of that experience as well. If you try and intrude on it and say, maybe as some therapists do, trite things like, how does that make you feel? Then you've intruded on something which should be sacrosanct. And it's only through the experiencing of something that you do know its true meaning. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you then have to try and put it into any kind of formal structure, such as describe it in words. It may defy being described.
It does, doesn't it?
In words.
Because affect does not translate into cognition.
No.
It's a state. And because it's an evolutionary state of consciousness, we've capped it with the way that our brain has evolved. It can only now indicate its presence as a signal that there is something else. But cognition and affect cannot integrate without meaning. They don't translate because they're completely different languages. The Rosetta Stone is meaning. That allows you to do that. But when meaning powers through, it provides, as I say, that matrix for cognition and affect to agree on the experience of meaning. And at that point, you get what the Jungians think of as being integration. It's not easy to do, though, because in an everyday sense, we're not set up to experience meaning in a meaningful way. It's transient. And the ego has evolved to deal with the external world, not the internal world. But affect arises from the inner world, and it speaks and communicates in a different language and in a different way. So it is difficult until you realize how simple it is to begin to make sense by accessing meaning. And there are so many really good ways of doing this, which we won't have time to go through today or in the depth that would be required. But it is simple. It has to be simple, otherwise homeostasis won't work. And we'll be in a permanent state of neurosis. But the fundamental neurosis that we have is an individuation neurosis, all of us, an adaptation to life and to lifespan development. And what happens when cognition and affect do not understand one another and then don't realize that there is a third phase state of consciousness that you have to access that will allow those to join together. But when you see people, and they're usually academics on the internet who produce this kind of thing, where they collapse around a core idea and inflate with emotion and generate fantasy to support that, they're miles away.
You do.
From any integration on the inside at all. but they'll be continually amped up and overpowered because the libido that they have, the free energy within their system is attempting to force a compensation on them, but all they know how to do is to repeat repetition compulsion, the same mistake they've made all along, and generate more and more inflated fantasy and more of a collapsed idea. But there are simple ways of solving this. And then there's other kinds of fantasy, such as porn, which is, I don't know what she's smiling at me for. I don't
well, you've taken that in a completely unexpected direction.
Of course. It's always good to do that, to take things
keep people off balance again. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. But pornography is the symbolic representation of something which allows libido to be ducted off into it. And representation is everything. If something is not represented to consciousness, it is as if it does not exist. But as Pauline said earlier, it does. It exists in other states. We have a subjective waveform collapse of the informational field that makes up our life. And that's what we're capable of being conscious of at any one moment. But there's an objective waveform, which in essence is everything else, which is there at the same time. And they include, or this includes, other kinds of consciousness, other qualia of consciousness. So when depth psychologists like us sometimes say unconscious, what we really should say is non-ego conscious, because the so-called unconscious is conscious. It regulates information, it exchanges energy and information, it determines action. But consciousness as such does not stop there. It's superpositioned further upstream. It's in instincts. It's in what we call meta instincts, which are the narratives through which the Panksepian instincts are expressed. They provide the context, the anticipation for how life is going to go. Behind that, of course, is the mechanism of gene expression regulated by the genome, and then by those fields which organize everything. And they bottom out into the kind of field that Rupert Sheldrake looks into, and even Penrose and Hameroff as well, with their wonderful model of how consciousness operates in a field sense at the quantum level. But all of these states are simultaneously present, but we're only aware of a small part of it. And once we collapse into one representational state, we necessarily fill up our ego's capacity to deal with information, with whatever we've collapsed around. That doesn't make everything else go away. It's still there, and it's still trying to effect us as well as affect us. Once you know this, and you then find the ideal mechanisms for making access and communication between these representational states open, you can move energy and information around, and you can make your conscious mind more efficient in how it deals with things. And we could say that pornography and a so-called porn addiction that so many of these young guys seem to be suffering from, because they've been told they're suffering from it, rather than understanding what its purpose is, then you can help them to understand too that it's just a relationship that they are having, albeit non-ego consciously, to their instincts. They're insisting that they should go out and adapt along their lifespan development trajectory as anticipated by their genome. And there are times in life when we have to do things like that for a period of time, so long as we don't build up a fantasy system which becomes autonomous and stops us growing and moving away from those fantasies. Complexes, in other words, they are the problem. And there are two kinds, Jungian and deep structure, but we'll save that for another time. But when you understand the difference between those and how they operate, then you will be able to sort all of this out. Right, so maybe the best way of illustrating the particular form of fantasy we want to discuss today is to bring a case study in. Yeah, so one case that we're both familiar with is someone who's moved into a new geographical location. And as a result of that, all sorts of things are changing for this person. And it's interesting, I think, because of what Jung said about mind and earth, about places having a psychology of their own. And we found in our work, haven't we, that it's not so much where you're born that matters, but more where you come to consciousness. And if you can reboot yourself by moving to a new area, And that rebooting might mean a lowering of your own awareness of yourself, a suppression or even repression of the continuity of your self-concept from the past. It's as if you're being reborn in a new place. And that would mean that that area can imprint itself upon you and give shape to the way that you move forward. Now, that's a kind of fantasy, but it's teleological, isn't it? It's got a purpose behind it. So, you know, we know a few people that this has happened to. Some of them have moved abroad, and others have moved more locally to them, but still into a new area.
Well, that's absolutely the case. I mean, as you rightly say, Steve, that connection to a place, to a geographical place or to the land is a very important one. But the coming to consciousness aspect of it is more important than anything. And you could, as well, in a classical Jungian sense, connect that to the idea of the anima, the positive anima, if it's a man we're talking about. And the reason I say that is because obviously men and women are connected to nature, to the natural world. It's an important extension of who we are, and it's the context in which we've evolved as well, over thousands and thousands of years. And the connection, the special connection I think that women have, just as a quick aside, is that obviously women give life. And when we think of nature, we think of the cycles of nature and of rebirth and of renewal and the restoration of life again, say in the spring. And so for men in particular, and often it's young men who are going through some kind of transition, there will be that desire for relatedness in the way that the positive anima connects a man to both his inner world and his outer world.
Yeah, and that would include the continuity as well, wouldn't it, of the self-concept?
Absolutely, yes, it would.
It's very interesting, Steve, what you say about people who are too one-sided cognitively, intellectually, then being overwhelmed by affect, and the affect then starts to power their ideas, and often they will deliver those ideas by shouting or ranting. They have that kind of ideas and have that energy behind them, whereas, and you've said this a few times now, it's just impacted me really how true it is, that people who are truly integrated and connected to meaning are usually, they live their lives simply. They're usually calm and quiet, and they express their ideas in a calm and quiet and controlled way. And you don't see any of that.
No,
they're completely at peace with themselves. And I think that's an indicator really of how closely someone is connected to the idea of meaning. I mean, obviously, as I think you've already said, it's a relatively fleeting state, because we do ultimately have to be adapted to the outside world. But where it is present, that's how it tends to manifest. You tend to see somebody who is very calm, is very simple in their habits, in their way of life, and feels no need to deliver their ideas with that kind of force behind them.
Yeah, absolutely true. Yes, and you see that in everyday life too, with people that you may meet, and people who live a simple life, as you say, and they're connected up, they are calm. And sometimes passion can be so overamped, and that's the key, isn't it?
It is, yes.
That it's so overamped that a person's in a permanent state of agitation. So there's no satiation of the drive within them, because they are so agitated in their engagement with others. They shout an awful lot. They talk over people. They inflict their conflict on others as well through their beliefs. And that's actually something which is very unpleasant to experience on an interpersonal way. But you do get it with people who are manic personalities, or who are inflated, or have religious inflation in particular. I mean, even Jung said that Hitler spoke or shouted so loudly because he spoke with 80 million voices.
Yeah.
It was as if he was a medium for the collective unconscious of the German nation, as it was at that time. But now on the internet, you get a similar phenomenon that a person will shout as loudly as their subscriber list because they speak with all of those voices or shout with it as well. And we can sometimes think that's passion, and it sometimes is, because not all internet gurus have this problem, but the more exaggerated ones for sure do. And you will find people like that as inpatients in psychiatric hospitals undergoing treatment and care because of the suffering that they are going through. But when that's extended out and it becomes everybody else's suffering through suggestion, that's not a nice thing. It's not very social to do that to other people.